If you are over 65, I want to ask you something before we go any further. What if the one habit that quietly helped me feel stronger in my late years was not a rare supplement or an expensive treatment, but something so simple that most people overlook it every single day? I have watched many wonderful people spend years searching for complicated answers, while the smallest daily choices slowly shaped how they felt, how they moved, and whether they could continue living on their own. I also watched others believe that growing older meant giving up little by little, until one morning they realized they no longer recognized the person looking back at them in the mirror. But I learned something that changed the way I looked at aging forever, and I wish someone had whispered it into my ear much earlier. I am 98 years old now, and after more than 70 years studying how the human body changes with age, I have come to believe that the greatest surprises rarely make newspaper headlines. They happen quietly in ordinary kitchens, around modest dinner tables, and inside habits that seem almost too simple to matter. Years ago, when I was 67, I found myself exhausted in ways I could not explain. My waist had slowly grown larger, my blood sugar readings were moving in the wrong direction, and even after a full night's sleep, I woke feeling as though my body had forgotten how to recover. I had spent decades reading research and teaching students, yet standing alone in my own kitchen one morning, I realized that knowledge means very little if we never apply it to ourselves. That realization frightened me more than any laboratory report ever could. Instead of looking for a miracle, I began paying attention to people who reached their 90s with bright eyes, steady hands, and enough strength to enjoy ordinary life. I listened to families in different countries, spoke with neighbors, former patients, friends, and farmers, and I noticed that many of them shared a few quiet habits that almost nobody talked about. At first, I doubted what I was seeing because the answers looked too ordinary. Then the pattern became impossible for me to ignore. Today, I want to share the 5 discoveries that changed the direction of my own life, beginning with the one that almost made me laugh when I first heard about it. By the time we reach the final habit, you may understand why I no longer think healthy aging begins with searching for something extraordinary, because sometimes the greatest change starts during the hours when we choose not to eat at all. And that story is far more surprising than you might imagine. When I finally admitted to myself that something had to change, I stopped looking only at numbers on laboratory reports and started paying closer attention to people. That may sound surprising coming from someone who spent most of her life in medicine, but I had reached a point where I needed more than charts and statistics. I needed to understand why some men and women remained active well into their 90s, while others, despite receiving good care, gradually lost the energy to enjoy ordinary days. I began noticing little things that most people would probably dismiss. During my travels and conferences, I often stayed an extra day just to walk through local markets. I would watch older couples choosing vegetables, speaking with farmers, and carrying simple baskets filled with foods that had been part of their lives for decades. None of them spoke about miracle cures. None of them claimed to have discovered the secret to living forever. Yet many of them carried themselves with a quiet confidence that fascinated me. Around that same time, I visited an old colleague who had recently celebrated his 93rd birthday. We had worked together many years before, and I expected to find him tired and withdrawn. Instead, I found him tending a small garden, laughing with his grandchildren, and preparing lunch without any hurry. As we ate together, I noticed that most of his meal had been cooked the day before and chilled overnight. When I asked why, he simply smiled and said that his wife had always insisted food sometimes became even better after resting. I laughed politely because I thought she was talking only about flavor. Years later, I realized there was much more to that simple habit than I had imagined. That conversation stayed with me, and it encouraged me to look more carefully at ordinary routines instead of searching for dramatic solutions. Little by little, I also changed my own evenings. I became less interested in eating late at night, more willing to prepare tomorrow's meals in advance, and more curious about how my body responded to these gentle adjustments. I cannot say every change happened quickly, because it did not. Some weeks I felt discouraged. In other weeks, I noticed small improvements that gave me hope. Those quiet victories mattered far more than dramatic promises ever could. Then, one unexpected conversation with a woman almost 20 years older than I was at the time completely changed how I thought about one humble food that most families have been eating their entire lives. And what she told me became the fifth place on my list, though the reason took me years to fully understand. The first habit on my list is probably not what most people expect to hear, because it begins with foods that many of us have been eating since childhood. Potatoes, rice, oats, and other grains have often been treated as something to fear as we grow older, and for many years I accepted that idea without asking enough questions. Then I began noticing something interesting. Several of the healthiest older people I met did not avoid these foods completely. Instead, they prepared them in a different way. One elderly woman in Northern Europe invited me into her kitchen after a community lecture. She served me boiled potatoes that had been cooked the evening before, cooled overnight in the refrigerator, and gently warmed before lunch. She smiled when she noticed my puzzled expression and said, "Food deserves a little patience." At the time, I thought she was simply following an old family tradition, but later I discovered that researchers had also become interested in this quiet habit. Some studies suggest that when certain starchy foods are cooked and then cooled, part of their starch changes into what is called resistant starch. I like to think of it as food that takes a slower path through the body. Researchers continue studying exactly how much this may help, but many believe it can support a healthier gut, encourage beneficial bacteria, and contribute to a steadier rise in blood sugar after meals for some people. That did not mean everyone would respond the same way, and I reminded myself that people living with diabetes or other health conditions should always discuss important dietary changes with their own doctor and observe how their individual body responds. I decided to experiment gently in my own kitchen. Instead of cooking fresh rice every evening, I prepared enough for 2 days. I did the same with potatoes and occasionally with barley. To my surprise, I enjoyed the convenience almost as much as the meals themselves. I no longer felt rushed, and planning ahead made it easier to avoid unnecessary snacks late in the evening. Over time, I noticed that I felt comfortably satisfied after these meals instead of searching the pantry an hour later. Was that change caused only by the cooled starch? I cannot honestly say. Perhaps it was also the slower pace, the smaller portions, or the simple comfort of having nourishing food already waiting for me. Life has taught me that healthy habits often work together instead of alone. But as encouraging as that discovery was, another humble ingredient sitting quietly in my spice cabinet soon caught my attention, and the story behind it surprised me even more than those cooled potatoes ever could. By the time I reached the fourth place on my list, I had already learned a lesson that stayed with me for the rest of my life. The greatest mistakes are not always about eating the wrong foods. Sometimes they come from using the right foods in the wrong way. I cannot count how many times I heard people say they had tried a certain spice or a certain healthy ingredient, only to conclude that it made no difference. Years ago, I might have said the same thing. Then one afternoon, while speaking with an elderly researcher after a conference, our conversation drifted away from complicated studies and toward the ordinary meals we both prepared at home. He asked me a simple question that caught me completely off guard. "When do you add turmeric?" I answered that I sprinkled it into soup while it simmered. He smiled kindly and told me that there was another detail worth understanding. Later, I began reading more carefully, and I found that researchers were exploring how turmeric seemed to work differently when it was enjoyed together with a small amount of black pepper, and a source of healthy fats such as olive oil. Some studies suggest this combination may help the body make better use of certain natural compounds found in turmeric, although scientists continue studying exactly how much this matters in everyday life. That small discovery reminded me once again that nature often works through partnerships rather than single ingredients. I slowly introduced this habit into my own meals. A warm vegetable soup, a drizzle of olive oil, a pinch of black pepper, and just enough turmeric to add its beautiful golden color became part of my weekly routine. I never expected dramatic overnight changes, and none arrived. What I appreciated instead was the feeling that I was caring for my body with patience rather than urgency. As the years passed, I noticed that many of the healthiest older people I met thought in exactly the same way. They were remarkably consistent without becoming obsessive. They accepted that no single food could solve every problem, but they also respected the quiet influence that small choices could have over many years. Of course, I also learned that turmeric is not suitable for everyone in the same way. People taking blood thinning medication or medicines that affect blood sugar should always discuss regular use with their doctor before making changes, because even natural products may interact with treatment. That gentle reminder became just as important to me as the spice itself. Yet the next discovery on my list was even more surprising because it involved tiny green sprouts that looked almost too delicate to matter, and they completely changed the way I looked at ordinary vegetables. The third place on my list belongs to something so small that many people walk past it without giving it a second glance. If someone had shown me a tray of tiny broccoli sprouts when I was a young physician, I doubt I would have imagined they would one day become one of the most talked about foods in my own kitchen. Yet life has a wonderful way of teaching us humility. During my 80s, I met a retired school teacher who was 94 years old and still cared for her own garden every morning. She laughed when I admired her energy and led me to a sunny windowsill where several glass jars were filled with fresh green sprouts. "These are my little daily companions," she told me. I smiled, thinking she was joking, but she explained that growing them gave her joy because they reminded her that new life can begin from the smallest seed. That conversation stayed with me long after I returned home. Curious as always, I began reading what researchers were discovering about young cruciferous sprouts. Some studies suggest they contain much higher amounts of certain natural protective compounds than the fully grown vegetables. Researchers continue studying how these compounds may help support the body's natural defense systems, particularly as we grow older. I appreciated that the evidence was still developing, yet I found the idea fascinating enough to try the habit myself. Before long, I was growing broccoli sprouts in simple glass jars on my kitchen counter. They required little space, only fresh water, patience, and a few minutes of attention each day. Watching those tiny green shoots appear every morning became almost as satisfying as eating them. I usually sprinkled a small handful over salads, soups after they had cooled slightly, or an omelet just before serving. One nutrition scientist also shared an interesting detail with me. He explained that adding a very small pinch of mustard powder to cooked cruciferous vegetables might help preserve the activity of some beneficial natural compounds that heat can reduce. I found that idea both practical and surprisingly simple, and it soon became another quiet habit in my kitchen. Of course, I also learned to remain thoughtful rather than enthusiastic without limits. People living with thyroid conditions should discuss significant dietary changes involving cruciferous vegetables with their healthcare professional, especially if they plan to eat them regularly. That balance between curiosity and caution has guided me throughout my life. Still, even these remarkable little sprouts were not the most surprising discovery on my journey. The next place belonged to an ancient oil with a history stretching back thousands of years. and what I learned about it completely changed my expectations once again. Now we come to the second place on my list, and I must confess that I approach this one with more caution than excitement. Throughout my career, I learned that when something has been valued for centuries, it deserves both curiosity and careful thinking. That is exactly how I felt when I began hearing more about black seed oil. I had first encountered it many years earlier, while attending a medical conference in the Middle East. Several local colleagues spoke warmly about how their families had used it for generations, not as a miracle remedy, but simply as part of their traditional way of caring for themselves. At the time, I smiled politely and moved on with my work. Only much later, after I had begun paying closer attention to the daily habits of healthy older adults, did I decide to look at it again with fresh eyes. Researchers continue studying the natural compounds found in black seed oil, and some studies suggest they may help support normal metabolic function and the body's natural energy balance. I found those early findings interesting, but what impressed me even more was the attitude of the people who used it regularly. None of them expected dramatic changes overnight. They treated it with patience, consistency, and respect, the same way they approached every other healthy habit in their lives. That lesson became more valuable to me than the bottle itself. When I decided to include black seed oil in my own routine, I chose a high quality cold pressed variety and used only a small amount with breakfast a few mornings each week. I paid attention to how I felt, avoided rushing to conclusions, and continued discussing my overall health with my own physician during regular visits. Looking back, I believe this careful approach helped me stay realistic while still remaining open to learning something new. I also discovered an important reminder that I never fail to share. Because black seed oil may influence the way the body responds to certain medications, especially those used to manage blood pressure or blood sugar, anyone taking these medicines should speak with their healthcare professional before adding it regularly to their routine. Natural does not always mean appropriate for every person or every situation. That simple truth has guided me throughout my life. And yet, despite everything I had learned from cooled grains, turmeric, sprouts, and black seed oil, the habit that made the greatest difference for me required no special ingredient at all. In fact, it asked me not to add something to my plate, but to become comfortable with leaving my plate empty for a little longer than I once thought possible. That final discovery changed the rhythm of my days in ways I never expected, and it is the story I have been waiting to share with you. The first place on my list turned out to be the simplest habit of all, yet it was also the one that required the most patience. It did not come from a bottle, a supplement, or an expensive food. It came from learning to give my body enough time between dinner and breakfast. I still remember how uncomfortable the idea felt when I first considered it. Like many people, I believed I needed something to eat late in the evening, even when I was not truly hungry. It had become a habit rather than a need. So instead of making a dramatic change, I moved slowly. I finished dinner a little earlier, then waited a little longer before breakfast. Week after week, those quiet adjustments became part of my life. To my surprise, I woke feeling lighter, more refreshed, and more ready to begin the day. Researchers continue studying how longer overnight breaks between meals may support the body's natural repair processes and encourage a healthier use of stored energy. Some studies suggest this approach may also help support metabolic health for certain people. I found those findings encouraging, but I never treated them as a guarantee. Every person is different, and I have always believed that listening to your own body is just as important as reading any scientific paper. For people living with diabetes or taking medications that affect blood sugar, changes to meal timing should always be discussed with a healthcare professional before becoming a regular habit. Looking back across nearly a century of life, I realize that food has never been the whole story. The healthiest older people I have known were not simply careful about what they placed on their plates. They kept moving every day, even if it was only a gentle walk around the neighborhood. They laughed often, stayed curious, welcomed conversations with younger generations, and found reasons to wake up each morning with purpose. They protected their independence by caring for both their bodies and their hearts. That is the lesson I hope you carry with you today. You do not have to change everything before tomorrow arrives. One small habit, practiced consistently, can become the beginning of a very different future. If today's conversation gave you hope, I would love for you to stay with me by subscribing to this channel. Together, we can continue exploring simple, thoughtful ways to support healthy aging, always with kindness, curiosity, and respect for both science and personal experience. And before you leave, please tell me your age and the country you are watching from. I always smile when I see how many different corners of the world are joined by the same hope of growing older with strength, dignity, and joy.